The lights were too bright. That was the first thing Elias remembered. The heat of them on his face. The way they turned 300 faces into a single blur of teeth and eyes. He stood beside his machine, hands trembling, waiting for it to do the one thing it was built to do. It didn't. A wire sparked. Smoke curled from the base. And then came the sound that would live in his chest for the next 20 years. Laughter, rolling through the gymnasium in waves, growing louder with every second he stood there, frozen, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to disappear fast enough. Somewhere in that laughter, a version of him died. The version who believed in something. The version who thought being different meant being remarkable, not ridiculous. Now, 2 decades later, that boy is a man standing alone in a workshop at 2 in the morning, the only light a single bulb swinging faintly above a workbench. The air smells of solder and old metal. Outside, the town sleeps. Inside, Elias stares at a shape beneath a canvas cloth, something he has spent months building in secret, something he is almost afraid to look at directly. His hand hovers near the fabric. It doesn't move, because some part of him is still standing on that stage, waiting for the laughter to start again. Why does a single moment of ridicule outlive grief, outlive failure, outlive almost everything else we survive? Why does the fear of being laughed at carve itself so deep into a person that it can silence them for a lifetime? Elias is about to find out whether that fear still owns him, or whether tonight, finally, he owns it instead. 3 weeks before that stage, Elias had been someone else entirely. He was the boy who stayed after class to sketch circuits on the back of homework sheets. The boy his physics teacher, Mr. Danvers, once called the sharpest mind this school has seen in years. A compliment Elias had carried like armor, right up until the moment it became a weapon used against him. The science fair was supposed to be his proof. A working model of a self-regulating energy converter, built from scavenged parts and 8 months of sleepless nights. He believed, with the particular certainty only a 16-year-old can hold, that this machine would change how people saw him. Not the quiet kid, not the outsider. Something else. Someone chosen. Instead, the capacitor failed under the gymnasium lights, and Mr. Danvers, the same man who had once praised him, let a smirk cross his face before the students even started laughing. That smirk was somehow worse than the laughter itself. It told Elias that even belief could curdle into mockery the moment you stumbled. The days that followed were quiet in a way that felt violent. Friends who used to sit with him at lunch drifted to other tables, not out of cruelty, but discomfort. Nobody wants to be near the boy who became a joke. Elias let them drift. It was easier than being seen trying and failing again. He quit the robotics club. He stopped raising his hand in class, even when he knew every answer. He learned, methodically, how to become forgettable, because forgettable people don't get laughed at. Forgettable people are safe. By the time he graduated, he had perfected a kind of vanishing act, trading ambition for anonymity, brilliance for silence. He told himself it was maturity, growing up, letting go of childish dreams. But it wasn't growth. It was armor built from shame, worn so long it had fused to his skin, and he wouldn't realize how heavy it had become until the night. Decades later, he stood before a covered shape in an empty workshop, afraid to look underneath. At 38, Elias Novak fixed other people's machines for a living. His workshop sat on the edge of town, wedged between a shuttered laundromat and a hardware store that had seen better decades. The sign above the door simply read repairs. No name, no ambition, nothing that invited attention. That was the point. Customers brought him broken things. Washing machines, generators, the occasional antique radio someone's grandfather refused to throw away. And he fixed them quietly, efficiently, without ever mentioning that he understood the physics behind their failures better than most engineers with framed degrees on their walls. He never mentioned it because no one ever asked. He was, by any honest measure, brilliant. And he was, by every measure that mattered to the town around him, unremarkable. A man who fixed toasters. A man nobody thought to wonder about. There was a strange comfort in that invisibility. No one laughed at a man who never showed them anything worth laughing at. No one mocked ideas he never spoke aloud. His talent had become a locked room inside him, and he had gotten very good at making sure no one ever found the door. He told himself this was peace. Some nights, staring at the ceiling above his small apartment, he almost believed it. Right up until the thought crept in, quiet, and persistent. That peace built on hiding wasn't peace at all. It was just a longer, slower kind of disappearing. The call came on a Tuesday. Dr. Halvorsen was gone. A quiet heart attack in his sleep. The kind of ending that felt almost insulting for a man who had spent his whole life chasing loud, impossible ideas. He had been Elias's physics teacher before Mr. Danvers, years earlier, in a different school, a different life. The only adult who had ever looked at Elias's strange sketches and said, "Keep going," instead of laughing. The lawyer's letter was brief. Halvorsen had no family left, and in his will, he'd asked for one specific favor, that Elias, and no one else, clear out his storage unit before the property was sold. The unit smelled of dust and old paper, the particular staleness of a place time had forgotten. Boxes of research notes. Broken instruments. A life's worth of half-finished obsessions stacked floor to ceiling. Elias worked through it methodically, the way he worked through everything, until his hand brushed against something metal, tucked behind a shelf, deliberately hidden rather than simply stored. A case. Steel, reinforced, padlocked, and stenciled across the top in Halvorsen's unmistakable handwriting. "Do not open until ready." Beneath it, a date. Elias stared at the numbers until his chest went tight, because he didn't need to check a calendar to know what that date meant. It was the exact week of the science fair. The exact week his life had folded in on itself in front of 300 laughing faces. His mentor had sealed something away in the same breath that Elias's world had ended, and never once, in all the years since, had Halvorsen mentioned it. Why lock something the same week Elias's dream had died? Why hide it instead of destroying it? And why leave instructions that it wait until Elias, specifically, was ready, as if Halvorsen had known, somehow, that this moment would come decades later, in a dusty storage unit, with Elias standing exactly where his old teacher must have known he'd eventually stand. His hands found the padlock before his mind caught up to the decision. The padlock gave way with a bolt cutter Elias found on Halvorsen's own workbench, as if his mentor had left the tool there on purpose. One last quiet instruction. The lid creaked open, and for a long moment, Elias simply stood there, unable to process what he was looking at. Blueprints. Dozens of them, yellowed at the edges, covered in a familiar, obsessive handwriting that revised the same core design again and again across what must have been years. And beneath the papers, wrapped in cloth like something sacred, sat the skeleton of a machine, components refined, corrected, elegant in a way his 16-year-old prototype never had been. It took him 3 full seconds to recognize it. It was his converter, his impossible, humiliating idea from the science fair. Except this version didn't look like the failure that had ended his childhood. This version looked like it worked. His hands were shaking as he found the envelope tucked beneath the final blueprint, his name written across the front in Halvorsen's careful script. "Elias, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're finally ready to look at what I couldn't let die. What happened to you on that stage wasn't failure. It was a flaw in wiring, nothing more. A problem I spent 20 years solving because I refused to let one bad night erase what I saw in you. I never told you because I was waiting for the right moment, and then I ran out of moments. This is yours now. Finish it. But be careful who learns of it before it's ready. Men like Danvers built careers mocking ideas like yours, and men like that don't forgive being proven wrong. Let no one find this until it stands on its own." Elias read the letter twice, then a third time, something cracking open in his chest that he didn't have a name for. Not quite grief, not quite hope, something dangerously close to both. For 20 years, he had believed that stage had ended something. Instead, it seemed, it had only paused it, hidden inside a locked case, waiting in the dark the same way he had been waiting, both of them frozen in the same unfinished moment. He looked down at the fragile skeleton of circuitry in front of him, and for the first time since he was 16 years old, Elias felt something dangerous stir beneath the armor. Not fear. Possibility. The workshop changed after that night. By day, Elias fixed washing machines and radios like nothing had happened. By night, he locked the door, drew the blinds, and became someone else entirely, hunched over Halvorsen's blueprints, soldering iron in hand, chasing a version of himself he thought had died on a gymnasium floor. Progress was slow and careful and quietly thrilling in a way he hadn't felt in 20 years. Then the small things started. A letter arrived from his landlord, vague and oddly formal, informing him his lease was under administrative review. No explanation, no prior complaint, nothing that made sense for a man who'd paid rent on time for 11 straight years. Then came the phone call from an old classmate he hadn't spoken to since graduation, asking, with too much casual interest, whether Elias had ever heard what happened to Dr. Halvorson's old research. The classmate's name was Marcus Reyes, someone Elias vaguely remembered as one of the louder laughers on that stage. Now, according to a quick search, a well-funded tech investor with a reputation for acquiring promising ideas before their inventors understood their worth. Elias told himself it was coincidence. Reyes couldn't know. No one could know. But the questions lingered anyway, small and sharp, burrowing into the quiet of his workshop at night. Who else had Halvorson told, even by accident? Who else might already be watching, waiting to see what Elias would build before deciding whether it was worth taking from him? Marcus Reyes arrived at the workshop on a Thursday afternoon, driving a car that cost more than the building itself. Elias recognized him instantly. Even after 20 years, the same easy grin, the same way of taking up space in a room like he owned the air in it. In school, Marcus had been the loudest voice in that gymnasium, the one whose laughter had started the wave that swallowed everyone else's. Now he wore a tailored jacket and an expression of practiced warmth, the kind men wear when they've learned that charm opens doors money alone can't. Elias Novak, Marcus said, like the name itself amused him. Still fixing washing machines? Elias said nothing, which Marcus seemed to enjoy. He didn't waste time. He'd heard, through channels he declined to name, that Elias had inherited some of Halvorson's old research. He was interested, very interested, in helping bring it to market. Funding, resources, a real lab instead of a rented shed behind a laundromat. He framed it as generosity, an old classmate extending a hand. But Elias watched his eyes while he spoke, and beneath the warmth there was something colder and more familiar. The same hunger that had once turned a room of teenagers into a wall of laughter. Marcus wasn't offering a hand. He was circling something valuable, the way wealthy men circle anything a poorer, quieter man hasn't yet learned to protect. I don't need help, Elias said finally. Marcus's smile didn't waver, but something behind it sharpened. Everyone needs help, Elias. Question is whether you get to choose the terms, or whether the terms get chosen for you. He left his card on the workbench, beside the very blueprints he wasn't supposed to know existed, and walked out without waiting for a response. Elias stood alone in the silence afterward, staring at the card, understanding with sudden clarity that the boy who once laughed at him from a gymnasium bleacher had grown into a man perfectly willing to take by force what he couldn't win by kindness. The rent notice arrived 11 days later, and this time there was nothing vague about it. The building's ownership had changed hands. A shell company Elias had never heard of now held the lease, and with it, a new set of terms that tripled his monthly payment overnight, effective immediately. He didn't need to dig deep to know whose money sat behind the paperwork. Marcus hadn't bothered hiding his signature so much as making sure Elias would recognize it anyway. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. It was a message: comply, or lose everything you're standing in. Elias ran the numbers late into the night, the way he used to run equations as a boy, except this time there was no elegant solution waiting at the end of the page. His savings, modest to begin with, wouldn't cover 3 months at the new rate, let alone the cost of the specialized components the device still needed. Materials that used to take weeks to save for now felt impossible, priced out of reach by a man who had never needed to worry about money in his life. He thought about calling Marcus, accepting the offer, trading the rights to Halvorson's life's work for enough security to keep the lights on. Then he thought about the letter in his mentor's handwriting. Let no one find this until it stands on its own, and the shame of imagining Halvorson's face if he learned Elias had folded the moment real pressure arrived. Still, folding wasn't an abstract fear anymore. It was arithmetic. Rent due in 18 days. A landlord who wasn't really a landlord. A body of work worth more than Elias could calculate, housed inside walls he might not be allowed to enter much longer. For the first time since finding the case, Elias understood that this wasn't just an old wound resurfacing. It was a war being fought on new terms. One where laughter had been replaced by leverage, and the fear of humiliation had been replaced by something colder and far more immediate. the fear of losing everything before he even had the chance to try. The rumor moved faster than Elias could trace it. It started small, a customer mentioning they'd heard he was building something big in the back of the shop. Then a comment on a local forum, vague but pointed, asking whether anyone knew what the repair guy was really working on. By the end of the week, a reporter from the regional paper had left 2 messages on his shop phone, and an email from an engineering forum moderator asked, with thinly veiled skepticism, whether Elias would be willing to demonstrate his claims to a panel of independent reviewers. He recognized the tone immediately. It wasn't curiosity. It was the sound of people sharpening knives before a kill, dressing mockery up as diligence. Word had leaked before he was ready, before the device could speak for itself, before a single working test had proven anything beyond hope and blueprints. If it were dragged into public now, unfinished, it wouldn't be judged as a work in progress. It would be judged the way his 16-year-old prototype had been judged, sparking, failing, laughable. Elias sat in the dark of his workshop that night, the half-built machine silent on the table in front of him, and felt the old gymnasium lights burning against his face all over again. 20 years had passed. The stakes had changed shape. Rent, reputation, a dead man's legacy instead of a teenage dream. But the fear underneath it hadn't aged a single day. He was, once again, standing on a stage before he was ready, waiting to see who would laugh first. He found the workshop door already open when he arrived that morning. The lock forced, splintered wood scattered across the concrete step. Inside, someone had been thorough. Tools swept off the bench. 2 of Halvorson's original blueprints torn and scattered across the floor. And at the center of the wreckage, the prototype itself, the delicate array of circuitry he'd spent months rebuilding, lay cracked open, its core components smashed beyond easy repair. Elias stood in the doorway for a long time, unable to move, the same paralysis that had once held him frozen on a gymnasium stage settling over him again, 20 years later, in a different room, wearing a different face. No note was left. None was needed. The message was the same one Marcus had delivered with his smile and his business card. You don't get to choose the terms. Something in Elias went quiet that morning. Not angry, not even afraid, just tired in a way that felt bottomless. He thought about Halvorson's letter, about the word ready, and wondered whether his mentor had simply been wrong about him. Maybe some people weren't built to survive being seen twice. He sat among the wreckage until the light outside shifted from morning to afternoon, seriously considering, for the first time since finding the case, simply walking away, selling what remained to Marcus, going back to fixing washing machines, to safety, to the long, slow disappearing he'd perfected so well. The old fear hadn't just returned. For a few silent hours, it very nearly won. It was the letter that pulled him back. Elias found himself rereading Halvorson's words that night, not for comfort this time, but for permission. What happened to you on that stage wasn't failure. It was a flaw in wiring, nothing more. He had spent 20 years treating one bad night as a verdict on who he was. His mentor had spent those same 20 years treating it as a problem to be solved. Only one of them had been right. He didn't call Marcus. He didn't sell the rights, didn't fold, didn't disappear back into the safety of forgettable work. Instead, over the next 9 days, he rebuilt what had been broken, sleeping in short bursts, hands raw from solder burns, running on something that felt less like hope and more like defiance. When the local Science and Innovation Fair opened its doors that weekend, the same annual event, held in the same gymnasium, 20 years almost to the date, Elias signed up under his own name for the first time since he was 16. The room filled the way rooms like that always did. Reporters drawn by rumor, engineers drawn by skepticism, and near the front, unmistakable in a tailored jacket, Marcus Reyes, arms crossed, wearing the same expression he'd worn from the bleachers 2 decades earlier. Elias stepped onto the stage. The lights were just as bright as he remembered. His hands, for one terrible second, trembled exactly the way they had when he was 16. Then he steadied them, and he began. He walked the room through Halvorson's design, through his own corrections, through 9 sleepless days of rebuilding what sabotage had tried to destroy. And when the moment came, the same moment that had once ended in sparks and smoke and laughter, he activated the device. The room held its breath. The machine hummed to life, steady and clean, light gathering along its circuits exactly as the blueprints had promised. No sparks, no smoke, no failure. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then the silence broke, not into laughter, but into something Elias had never once let himself imagine standing in that exact spot. Murmurs of disbelief. A reporter half rising from her seat. Scattered applause growing into something louder, less scattered, undeniable. Elias didn't look for approval in the crowd. He looked, instead, at Marcus, and found him utterly still, the smile finally gone from his face, replaced by something Elias recognized instantly, because he had worn it himself for 20 years. Fear. For the first time in his life, the laughter Elias had spent 2 decades running from never came at all, and in its absence, something inside him that had been frozen since he was 16 years old finally, quietly, began to thaw. The questions began before Elias had even stepped down from the stage. A reporter, the same one who'd left skeptical messages on his shop phone days earlier, was now asking something entirely different, not whether the device was real, but who had tried to stop it from being seen. It took very little digging for the story beneath the story to surface. The shell company behind his sudden rent increase, the forced lease review, the timing of a break-in that had conveniently occurred just as word of his research began to spread. All roads led back to Marcus. By the time local news picked up the story 2 days later, it wasn't framed as a triumphant invention piece alone. It was framed as a wealthy investor's attempt to sabotage and quietly acquire the unfinished work of a man he'd once humiliated in that very gymnasium. Former classmates came forward, unprompted, remembering exactly who had led the laughter 20 years earlier. The narrative Marcus had spent a career building. Visionary, generous, ahead of the curve, cracked apart under a light he could no longer control. Elias didn't gloat. He didn't need to. Watching Marcus's carefully built reputation dissolve in real time was its own quiet justice, one he'd never had the power to demand and never had to ask for. What came instead was something he'd never let himself want: legitimate offers. Established firms, engineers who had once dismissed him, universities that had rejected Halvorson's original research decades earlier, all reaching out now with funding, lab space, full public credit under both his and Halvorson's names. This time, Elias chose the terms. He accepted a partnership that let him keep creative control, that named Halvorson as co-inventor posthumously, that turned a locked steel case in a forgotten storage unit into the foundation of something real. Every signature on every contract felt like a small, deliberate answer to a fear that had once controlled his entire life. Somewhere, he hoped, Halvorson was watching. Not because he needed permission anymore, but because some victories are only complete when shared with the person who believed in them first. 6 months later, the sign above the workshop door read something new. Elias had kept the building. Marcus's shell company had quietly relinquished the lease once its true owner's name became a liability rather than an asset, but the space inside had transformed. Where once there had been only silence and secrecy, there was now noise. The hum of soldering irons, the low murmur of teenagers hunched over half-finished projects, the occasional spark that no longer made his chest tighten with old memory. He'd started small. A single after-school program for kids the rest of the town had quietly stopped paying attention to. The strange ones, the quiet ones, the ones who sketched circuits on the backs of homework sheets and had learned, too early, to hide it. Elias recognized every one of them, because he had once been exactly that child, waiting for someone to say keep going instead of laughing. He said it now, as often as he could. On the wall above his workbench, framed rather than hidden, hung Halvorson's original letter, the one that had waited 20 years to find him ready. Beside it sat the first working prototype, no longer covered by a cloth, no longer something to fear uncovering. Because that, in the end, was the answer to the question that had opened this story. Humans don't fear laughter itself. They fear what it once meant. A moment of being truly seen and truly rejected, a wound so specific it convinces us that vanishing is safer than trying again. Elias had believed that for 20 years. It had nearly cost him everything he was ever capable of becoming. But fear, he had learned, was not a life sentence. It was only a door, closed for a while. And every door, eventually, can be opened again by someone brave enough, or simply tired enough, to finally reach for the handle.